Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Science Thursday with Brookhaven Lab. My name is Aleida Perez from the Office of Educational Program here at Brookhaven National Laboratory, and I'm joined by my colleague, Diana Murphy, who will be managing the Q&A portion of today's discussion. Before I introduce our today's guest, just a few reminders. Submit your questions on the Q&A section on your screen, and we will try to get as many questions as we can possibly answer today. And if you have any questions or any issues or difficulties with the video stream, you can let IT know by making a comment on the chat section, and we will be glad to help. Right? So today I am joined by Dr. Peter Guida, a medical scientist and also a liaison biologist to the NASA Space Radiation Laboratory at Brookhaven National Laboratory. And Peter is joining us today to talk about his team's work to better understand the risk of space radiation to human space travelers. Welcome, Peter. How are you?
Very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Perez. And I want to say hi to everyone for joining on this seminar series. And we're going to have a good time today.
I think so. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. It is a pleasure, like I said, having you here today. And we're going to be discussing about space radiation and the risk to human travelers. As we know, humans have been traveling to space maybe before 1960, but we know that during the 1960s, we landed on the moon. And then that led, followed up by the creation of the International Space Stations and the space shuttle programs and so on. And as we move forward, one of the major focus that we'll be having is to send humans to Mars. That's one of the near future projects. So in order for humans to travel safely through space, it is important that we have an understanding what those health risks are, particularly as the travel to Mars is a very long journey through space. So this is one of the reasons that NASA commissioned in 2003 the Space Radiation Laboratory here at Brookhaven National Laboratory. And so I'm hoping that we can get a sense of that, and also people have a feeling that the collaborative effort that it takes to get the project's questions like they've been answered in terms of understanding better the risk of space travelers. So Peter, before we start, can you tell us a little bit more for people that may not know, what is radiation? What is of a concern for astronauts?
Okay, well, thank you. Most of us have heard the term radiation, and it's been in the news a lot, and there are many different types of radiation, but the NASA Space Agency characterizes radiation exposure to astronauts as being one of the critical risks that they could face that would potentially compromise mission objectives. There are other factors as well, but radiation really stands out as one of the major ones because the environment is such, once you break away from Earth's protective magnetosphere and atmosphere, the exposure to radiation in space during travel is inevitable. There are mechanisms like shielding that can play a role, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. But the environment of radiation in space is very different than that here on Earth and the types of forms that we're used to dealing with. One thing I do want to make a point of, though, about radiation as a whole, and if you could put the first slide up, that would be great. So this is a slide that I use when I introduce most of my presentations, and it's to give people a little bit of a taste about the history of radiation research. And what you can see here is the names, Roentgen, Becquerel, Curie, those are giants in the field, and those names were adopted to describe the units of radioactivity because these people were such pioneers. But the message here is that using a scientific method of proven with control groups and such research, radiation has been studied in that formal capacity for well over 100 years, 120, almost 125 years now. And the study, if you'll take a look at the picture on the bottom, this is Pierre Curie and his forearm. And this is right at the turn of the last century. he intentionally exposed his forearm to a source of radium, which is a radioactive material that he and his wife had discovered, and went on to describe the burn, the circular burn that was induced in his forearm by the intense radiation source, and then the healing that took place in the ensuing weeks. So my conclusion from this is that we could never get an experiment like this passed through a safety committee today, thank goodness. But also that scientists are very serious and dedicated to what they do. So that's a little taste of history of radiation. If you can go to the next slide, this touches a little bit more on what you had mentioned about the type of radiation that we come encounter with. And I'm gonna make a contrast with how that's different than what's in space. So without getting too lost in the details, I do want to talk about the difference between what's called electromagnetic radiation and particulate radiation. And electromagnetic is the type that most people are familiar with. And you can see the examples on the bottom, things like X-rays, gamma rays, radio waves, and even light. You know, X-rays when you go to the doctor's or dentist's office, right? We're aware of that as being a type of radiation. This type of radiation has no mass and no charge. But it can be harmful, and that's why the dentist throws that big heavy lead apron on you before he or she gets ready to x-ray your teeth, so that you're shielded and protected from the source of the radiation. But I also want to point out on that last bullet point, things like radio waves and even visible light, the light coming out of the bulbs up in here, those are actually types of radiation, and we might not really think of it that way, but they are, and we don't necessarily get concerned about driving in our car and we have the radio on and there are radio waves going from the tower that broadcasts it into the unit in our vehicle so that we can hear the music. Or when we're sitting in the office or in the laboratory or in class and the light, the visible light comes down from the bulbs, that's another form of radiation. The difference there is that those forms of radiation don't have enough energy to do what's called ionize. And ionization is a fancy term for meaning breaking chemical bonds. So whereas X-rays can do that, things like radio waves and visible light can't. So they're not really harmful, or not things that we think of as harmful. But it's a good brain exercise, though, to think about that radiation is really all around us, but it's not necessarily bad in all circumstances. This is different than the type of radiation that's found in space. That is harmful, and it's been known for a long time. And again, going back to the Curies from over 100 years ago, it wasn't known then that radiation damages DNA, the DNA in our cells that contains all of our genetic material, because DNA hadn't been discovered back then. But it was known that exposure to radiation was harmful. And in space, radiation does have mass and charge, unlike X-rays or gamma rays. And because of that mass and charge, and also very high energy, kinetic energy in particular, those types of radioactive particles, that's the particulate radiation, pass right through the outside of the spacecraft, through the person's spacesuit, into their body, back out the other side of their body, and back out of the spacecraft. So that's something that's not going to happen when you get your teeth x-rayed, for example. And that's one of the main reasons why space radiation was hypothesized to be a major potential health risk to those people that encounter it. Mm-hmm. NASA's also been talking about going, as you alluded to, about going to Mars. There are other missions about going to one of Jupiter's moons, or a near-Earth asteroid, or even back to the moon. But if they go back to the moon, they're talking about staying for at least 6 months. Mm-hmm. Those other missions too, Jupiter's moon and an asteroid, would also take more than 6 months, on the order of a year or even longer, and a Mars mission would be approximately 2 to 3 years. So because, as I said, the radiation in space is all around the capsule and spacecraft, and therefore the astronauts, the longer you're out there, the more radiation you're going to get exposed to. And I'm old enough to remember the Apollo missions back in the 70s with the grainy black and white footage and such when humans first landed on the moon. The longest Apollo mission was 12 days, and most of them were shorter than that. Yet now NASA's talking about going further and exploring, vaster regions of space. And again, we're talking about missions that are years long, and that means more radiation exposure. And that's why the NASA Space Radiation Laboratory, or NSRL as it's called, was built here at Brookhaven National Lab and commissioned in 2003. So we've been at this for about 17 years. studying what the potential negative effects to human beings would or could be from exposure to this special, different kind of radiation like that found in space.
So, it's very interesting because, you know, you said it's the energy of that radiation, and because we're going to be there for such a long period of time, the long time of exposure is of, you know, concern to the traveler. And then you mentioned about the lab, not NSRL being centered here at BNL. Why BNL was chosen, and you know, and not another place within the DOE system?
Well, that's actually a very fortuitous situation, and you know, there are some really bright people working at NASA, and they took advantage of the fact that Brookhaven National Laboratory already had what's called a particle accelerator, and that's for the Relativistic Heavy Ion Collider, or RHIC project. A particle accelerator takes a large amount of land and also a sizable amount of time to build, and then accordingly with that, a great deal of money. And so starting one from scratch, you know, getting the available land, taking the 3 years it would take for approximately to build it, and also the hundreds of millions of dollars that it would take to do it, is a pretty big hurdle to overcome. So the folks at NASA partnered up with the Department of Energy, which runs Brookhaven National Laboratory, and the folks at BNL as well, and came to a win-win kind of agreement where they built a sort of a satellite facility, the NASA Space Radiation Lab, off of the existing beamline and particle accelerator complex here at BNL, so that it cost a lot less to make, it took a lot less time, and it took advantage of the fact that the accelerator here was already working and tried and true and tested, and had a nice history of success behind it. And so they tapped into a known quantity and did so economically. And that's why that it's here. And I mentioned win-win. It works very well for the RHIC program, which is a physics collider program where atoms get smashed together that are traveling at high speed in the accelerator, and then you look at the subatomic particles like quarks and gluons and muons and such that make up matter. When NASA runs its accelerator and RHIC runs the other parts of the accelerator, we share different components of the beamline, and so it winds up being less expensive than either programming have to run an accelerator solely for its one program. So it takes a little bit of coordination, but you know, we're scientists, we work together, and for the benefit of the overall good. And so, like I said, it works out better for both programs.
So the particles, the protons that are made here in the accelerator are not just a high energy, but also able to mimic, to produce all those protons that you might find in space, correct? So
yes,
to mimic that environment on land, so you can test before you go and on an actual mission. Is that correct?
Exactly. So there are two types of studies or avenues of study. There's called flight-based and there's called ground-based. Flight-based are the ones, when it comes to the NASA agency and such, that you usually see on TV. And that's when a rocket goes up or sends up some rover or a satellite or a crewed vehicle as well too. Those are flight-based studies, and they're terrific and they're very interesting. It captures national attention as it should. But there are a couple of drawbacks. One is you don't get many opportunities to do it. You might only go once a year or even less. After the space shuttle program was retired, the United States really didn't have a means to get up to space again other than to buy a seat on Russian Soyuz rockets. And even then, that might have happened once every year, sometimes every 2 years. It's also very, very expensive to do flight-based kind of experiments. And then there's a practicality issue. If anyone's ever seen a space capsule, like at a museum, Smithsonian or something, they're very, very small, and they're small for a reason, and that's because mass is critical when it comes to launching a vehicle outside of Earth's gravitational pull. That's why there's that big fireball of fuel that explodes, and the rocket takes off. It's trying to break away from the gravity that's trying to pull it back down again. And so that necessitates, again, a great deal of logistics and cost that goes into a flight-based experiment. The alternative is to do, as I said, ground-based studies. Correct. And so instead of bringing the samples up to space in your small capsule where you can't put that many samples, you bring kind of the radiation from space down to Earth. And you're not pulling it down out of the sky, but what you're doing is you're using a particle accelerator on the ground to strip electrons off of atoms, and then that is the type of radiation that flies around in space. And for those of you that have ever seen a periodic table in a chemistry book, all of those elements that are listed there, everything from atomic number 1, which is hydrogen, to atomic number 26, which is iron, those are all present in space. And as I said, as you pull electrons off of those, as the atom accelerates faster and faster in a ring, you're left with a residual positive charge because you're taking negatively charged electrons away. But you still have the mass, the nucleus in the nucleus of those atoms, and so you create those here on the ground, and then you can bring in your samples, expose them to a beam, which can be very carefully tuned. You can do experiments on Monday and come back again Tuesday and Wednesday. You don't have these long gaps in between. Cost-wise, it's a lot more price reachable.
Correct.
And as I said too, it's a lot more practical because you can expose a lot of samples. You're not really restricted in a space kind of
environment,
surface area sort of of an environment. So that's the pathway, and that was the rationale to put the accelerator here.
Very good. I'm very proud. Yeah, we've it's proud to be the site, for that kind of experiment.
Oh yeah, it was a big deal. It was a very big deal.
So Peter, there's a question in the chat. Is asking about the Kelly brothers. The one twin stay on Earth, the other twin went up to the space station, and in the space station. So the Kelly brother twin studies, the brother at the space station shows changes in his DNA sequence. Do they believe this was due to the space radiation? And then that's first part of the question. Then even though it is within the protection of the magnetosphere.
Okay, I'm really glad somebody brought up the Kelly twins, Mark and Scott. It's a very, very exciting study. They're identical twins. Not often do you get to have perfectly matched, genetically speaking, test subjects. It also is a really neat opportunity to do work directly on human beings because you remember my Pierre Curie with the forearm. We can't put a person in an accelerator beam again, like he did to himself, and then exposed to radiation and see what happens. So this is very carefully controlled. They're NASA employees. They go through lots of pre-flight training and have all kinds of other education and training activities about how to protect themselves. There are engineering teams that design the crew vehicles, the extra vehicular vehicles as well too. And then the mission itself is very carefully coordinated to minimize risks. But either way, it was a cover of Time magazine when the results first started to come back, and it's been the subject of many, many papers, some of which people got samples at the NSRL, and some of those investigators, and also compared back to what they found on the ground. So the primary studies that came out of it, and these are still ongoing, by the way, is that yes, there were changes in the DNA from one twin compared to the other. And as I started by saying, their DNA should be exactly the same anyway, since they're identical twins. So the changes attributed to space flight. And I believe it was Scott Kelly was the one that spent a little more than a year, or close to a year. I believe it was like 10 and a half months.
It was close to, yeah.
It was planned for a year, and it's essentially a year up on the space station. And what happens is you have change at the very end of the chromosome is a structure called a telomere. Some of you might have heard of that. And as we age, our telomeres get shorter naturally, and it's thought to be maybe like a clock mechanism in cells, so that cells kind of know when they've reached their natural lifespan, and then they eliminate and new cells get born, again, out of mitosis. There were studies taken up to look at the telomeres in particular in the DNA of the two Kellys, and yes, there were differences seen between them. Which, as I said, if they had never gone to space, ideally you really wouldn't expect any changes to be present. Yes, it was attributed to spaceflight. I encourage you to take a look at the Time magazine cover, or if you know how to use PubMed. or any of these other, or Google Scholar, or any of these, and I'll put in Kelly twins and findings and things like that, and you'll find some very interesting studies that have come out of that.
Yeah,
Some,
they came out. Some of those have some mutations, correct? Some of the Kelly twins, the mutations that appear in the twin in space and not here, and some of them stay, right? Some of them just stay long. It was a long stay with the twin that went to space. I think it was Scott Kelly.
That's correct. When we see that even in the ground-based experiments, when you grow cells in a petri dish, for example, our bodies are amazing. We have all kinds of different DNA repair enzymes present in all of our cells in our body, and there's different classes of them, and they specialize in fixing different kind of damage. So the radiation exposure damages DNA, as I mentioned before, but our bodies are so amazing, they will attempt to fix it and undo the damage. And while our bodies are very good at it, they're not perfect. And so sometimes the damage is either too extensive or it's too complex also. If it's a simple strand break, the cell can put the two strands back together again. But if a piece of a chromosome breaks off, that gets a lot harder for a cell to fix. And this is one of the things about the special type of radiation that's present in space, is because of the big size and mass and charge of the particles that are out there that are radioactive, they induce very complex types of damage in the DNA in cells, unlike X-rays, for example. So it's harder for our bodies to fix them. They'll do the best they can, but if they attempt to fix it, and there's a thing called error-prone DNA repair, but they put a new DNA base on because one gets knocked off, but they might not put the right one back on. That is now set in the genome, and that's a mutation. So that will stay, and then when that cell divides and gives rise to two daughter cells, both of those daughter cells will have that same mutation.
Because like you said, the cell will try to fix it, and if it gets overwhelmed, and if you just can't do it, it will stay with you. So that actually, when you and I were talking, you were talking about how the NSSRL looking at the health risks of the space travel, and you mentioned DNA damage, which has to do with cancer, right? So you are looking at as the space radiation, you're worrying about DNA damage, and not just the mutation, but if those mutations are harmful enough that can lead to a permanent damage in the function of the cell.
Yes, that's correct. There are three key areas that NASA is looking at that you're alluding to. So I said exposure to radiation in space is postulated to be potentially damaging to human beings on a biological basis, have negative effects, in other words. And there are three broad areas that NASA is particularly interested in. And the first one is the one you touched on, cancer. So cancer results from an accumulation of mutations over time. And if those mutations are in certain what are called hot spots, or in certain coding genes that, say, regulate how quickly a cell divides, or the regulation that's involved in the signals that cells are given to repair damage or to when they should divide, if there's an accumulation of mutations in those coding regions of key genes, then that can eventually turn a non-cancerous cell into a cancerous cell, even though it started as the same cell. And that's a process I've always been very interested in. It's how I got into this field. If we have time, we can talk about that later. Because of the way radiation damages DNA, and that DNA can lead to cancer, NASA's concerned about that. Will astronauts go up, get exposed to radiation in space during their missions, and then develop cancer later in life? The second major category is damage to the central nervous system, or CNS. So the same way, as I said, radiation comes in, it goes through whatever protective layers you have and goes back out the other end. That happens in your brain also. It goes through the space helmet, through the skull, into the tissues of the brain, and back out again. And so the same way, radiation damages DNA. It's affecting the cells in your brain the same way. It might kill certain cells if there's enough energy deposition. It can mutate the cells too, like we talked about, and thereby compromise their function or make them, lose their function. And so NASA is also concerned, will astronauts from exposure to radiation in space, especially on these longer missions, will their cognitive ability become affected where they maybe perhaps develop senility prematurely or dementia, or potentially even Alzheimer's disease? at a rate sooner than they would have if they were never astronauts as they age.
Yeah.
And then the third broad category is what NASA terms other degenerative effects, because radiation is going to go, it's not selective, it's not particular, it's going to go through every cell in your body randomly. So there are lines of evidence from these ground-based studies here at the Particle Accelerator that suggest that radiation exposure is also damaging to the cardiovascular system. So the heart and all the vessels, those fine little vessels, you know, as the branches of the arteries and veins go down and all the way to capillaries, that very sophisticated and intricate architecture is also damaged, as well as the tissue of the heart. So once again, they want to take a look at what is the potential, if any, that astronauts might be more prone to heart attacks or strokes, for example, having been exposed to radiation in space over the course of their careers.
That's a very interesting, because it, it has to do with the it can compromise the mission, right? It can compromise their safe return or the safe execution of their of what they need to do. There's a question on the chat, which I think is very interesting. It has to do with what we were talking about, cell damage and so forth. How might genetic techniques such as PCR or even CRISPR allow researchers to develop defense against space radiation?
Okay. See, now that's a really good one. You talked about defense against space radiation. NASA has a buzzword for that. It's called countermeasures. And so we're scientists. We're not going to sit by passively and just say, all right, well, okay, so space radiation is damaging, right? Mass, charge, like I've talked about, worse than like X-rays, and just say, okay, so if an astronaut gets exposed, they could get damaged, and that's it. That's the end of the story. It's not the end of the story. If we're smart about it and we understand the mechanisms of how the way a particle of radiation interacts with a cell and how it leads to biological damage, we can use our brains and try to devise techniques that would either block that damage or could counteract it in another way. But again, you have to understand the mechanism of how that happens. And so the CRISPR is a technique that's all in the news, and it's very, very exciting about how you could edit and alter human genes. We don't have CRISPR techniques yet going into this, but we do have people looking at gene therapy kind of based techniques. And so the thought was, could you take, for example, stem cells out of an astronaut's body before the flight, engineer them? I talked about DNA repair enzymes. So could you scale up the DNA repair enzyme so that, remember I talked about it being not perfect, but good, but not great. Could you make it great and like give them more copies of DNA repair enzymes or just scale it up and then put those same stem cells back into the same astronaut so there's no chance of rejection, and then send those astronauts to space and they would be like super radiation fighters. That's been talked about.
Cool.
It's a very difficult technical leap to overcome. Not necessarily because the theory isn't there, because actually we understand the theory. It has to do with the delivery of genes. Gene therapy was thought to be the holy grail of cancer research a while ago, where you could put the correct copy of a gene back into a person that had cancer and then undo the disease. It's proven to be logistically and technically difficult because of the ability to transfer a gene into a human being. It's been a lot more doable in mice, for example, but in humans, it's proven to be a lot more challenging. There are a lot of people still working on it, and it still holds a lot of hope and promise. But yes, there's the idea that you could do that. There are easier means of countermeasures in that one of the ways DNA is damaged is because we're bathed in water, right? Most of the bodies of human beings and mammals in general are some 70 to, I think, 75% water. And so all of our cells in our bodies are mostly made of water. So therefore, that's also surrounding the DNA in all of our cells. And when a radiation particle comes in, as I said, it deposits its energy. It splits the water molecule from H2O into H plus and OH minus. That OH minus is called a reactive oxygen species. It's negatively charged. And it's the OH minus that can go in then also and attack your DNA and cause those mutations that we talked about. So the theory, now again, understanding the mechanism involved in how that happens, people have decided, okay, if I prime the system or I treat, either pre-treat or treat an astronaut, for example, with antioxidants, the radiation particle will still come in. Like we said, it's kind of inevitable that's going to happen. It's very difficult to block. And it'll split the water molecules that surround the DNA. But if there are antioxidants there, when that OH minus is created, they'll sort of negate and neutralize those particles so that they can't go on to damage the DNA. So you still get the exposure the same, but you prevent the exposure from causing the DNA damage that it otherwise would have.
Yeah.
But I have to emphasize, if you don't understand the nuts and bolts and the way this stuff works, you're kind of stuck with just observing what happens. And we don't want to do that. And so one of my favorite studies is we have a researcher who makes a smoothie out of blueberries and strawberries and grinds them up and feeds them to test subjects or adds them to cells. And again, the theory being blueberries and strawberries are very rich in antioxidants. So if you know, could we get to a day where astronauts drink blueberry or strawberry smoothies like before the flight and maybe once a day while they're on the flight, get all those antioxidants in their system so that as their bodies get exposed to radiation along the way, it counteracts it and it fights back.
Yeah.
They wind up not getting the damage. So
yeah, that was going to ask you. So astronauts can, in theory, drink those, you know, have those as a countermeasures during the flight, just to reduce.
Absolutely, and that's a lot technically easier to do than to make super fighters with genetic engineering and gene therapy and stuff.
Cool,
but I mean, you know, the theory's there, and like I said, people are working on it. It's not, you know, we're not going to quit on this, but you start with what you can do, and then it also proves your theory about if you have a hypothesis that this is what's happening and this is what's leading to the development of cancer, for example, you can now test your blueberry extract and see if it undoes it, because you know the mechanism by which the blueberry extract would work. And if it does, when you test it in your ground-based experiments, it gives you an avenue to pursue going forward.
So there is a question that I think is interesting. Could you explain how some microorganisms such as tardigrades can survive such exposure to radiation? Also, could the p53 gene found in tardigrades help find a new therapy for cancer?
Wow, I love that one. Okay, so tardigrades, for those of you that don't know, are also commonly called water bears. And if you Google water bears, you'll see they look kind of like a sack of potatoes almost. It's kind of a diffuse sort of form, but it's one sort of sack kind of a thing. And they float along happily and they absorb nutrients in. But it was found that they are extraordinarily radiation resistant. They're also resistant to lots of other things, by the way, like temperature and moisture. So they can live in a completely desiccant environment for years. You put water back in again and they come back to life. Or you can, you know, deep freeze them, you know, or boil them, and then you know, again, you bring them back to a more normal temperature range, and they come back to life. So it was also found that they're very resistant to radiation. You come in with a big dose, and they still hum right along. So we actually have a researcher who has a project, and he and his team are coming back next month to do follow-up studies on this. It's been the subject of a 3-year grant. Again, asking the questions. Okay, so if tardigrades can withstand much, much higher radiation dose than, for example, mammalian cells, how do they do it? And they don't have a really big genome because they're very simple organisms. So this team took the entire genome, all the DNA of a tardigrade, and they're looking for sequences and segments in it that could potentially confer that great radiation resistance onto them. And then they've taken the next step after that. They've pulled out a bunch of candidate genes and introduced them into a higher organism, in this case, fruit flies, Drosophila, real fundamental organism of genetics in biology through many years. Nobel Prizes awarded for research with them and such. And it's kind of easy to introduce genes into fruit flies. And so then they're testing the fruit flies to see if particular genes that you introduce in will enable fruit flies to go from the dose they can withstand in a normal situation to the dose they can withstand if you put specific genes in and march through and test the different sequences of genes. Now, the theory here being is if you can identify 1, 2, 3 genes from a tardigrade and say, those are the two that make them be able to withstand a lot of radiation. Could we eventually transfer that one or two genes into astronauts and say, great, now they're able to withstand lots of radiation that they otherwise wouldn't be? Problem solved.
We'll have to wait and see, I guess. We have to wait and see. I know we're getting to something. I just have I don't know. So when you and I were talking, you were mentioning I'm a virus person by training. So I know that when you and I were talking, you also mentioned that in the NASA Space Radiation Lab, there are folks that are interested in viruses. But because, for example, when people get infected with chickenpox, it's a virus that stays with you forever. And when you get some stress in your side, it comes back as shingles. And so that is something that NASA is also exploring. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it's really interesting. So NASA puts out calls for grant proposals, like the same way the National Institute of Health or the National Cancer Institute, right, NIH, NCI, do. And there are very different and interesting avenues of research that people are getting funded for. And the concept of virologists doing work on this, as you mentioned, is also another one. And we've had a couple of different virology teams come here. One was particularly interested in herpes virus, and another one was interested in Epstein-Barr virus. And it's because those are very prevalent in the population. It's believed that about 80% of human beings have herpes virus in them, and then it becomes latent and all. But as you said, a stressor. Well, radiation exposure is a stressor. So is confinement in a capsule for maybe 2 years, traveling to Mars, for example, or being up on the moon for 6 months. So could those combinations of factors, both psychological, physical, there's microgravity in space too, and as well as the radiation exposure, could that reactivate viruses that are already present in astronauts that don't pose as much of a problem because now they've gone into a latent or like sleepy kind of a state? And they've looked at that, and there was some evidence that exposure to protons, which is a hydrogen atom, right, charge and mass of 1, without its nucleus, would reactivate herpes virus, and it predominantly goes to the optic nerve in the eye. So could that cause vision problems in astronauts? And the Epstein-Barr virus person whose specialty that was, as most of you probably know, Epstein-Barr virus makes you really tired and sluggish and just not really feel like yourself. If that gets reactivated in people, could it compromise mission objectives once again, where astronauts they feel sick, they're tired, they can't really coordinate all the things that it takes to pilot spacecraft and send out the communications to and from Earth and operate a robotic arm to gather samples, for example, and then pilot the vehicle back in through re-entry into the atmosphere and the landing and such. So yes, reactivation of viruses is another area of concern.
Yeah, that's a very cool. I think it gave a flavor of the many different aspects that that we all have to think about when we talk about the various health risks of space travel. And it's just a multitude it's a combination of different parameters that we must study and understand, because it's not so much that we don't have the technology to go and do these travel spaces. It's just understanding the risks, and then we can do those in a safe and in a way that we understand it and mitigate whatever problems comes along in that process.
Exactly. The reason we've been at this for 13 years, people might say, well, geez, aren't you done yet? Well, it like you said, it's a very multifaceted issue. We have cancer, we have CNS effects, we have viral activation, we have DNA damage. There's a lot going on that is biologically negative when you deal with radiation exposure to human beings.
So I'm just looking at the time, so I just want to pivot a little bit to your career path, because I know we're joined by students. So Peter, how did you become interested in this field? What motivated you to pursue cancer in the cancer field, and then join the NASA lab as well?
I'm glad we're going to have time for this, because I think it's important to find out what motivated people to do certain things. This is a tough career choice. I'm not going to kid anybody. There's a lot of very early mornings, very late nights, holidays, weekends, vacations. Those things don't really exist for us, but we love what we do. And when I get up in the morning, I'm excited to come to work and ask those scientific kind of questions. It gets me going to design experiments, do them, get the data, and then ask, what is this data really telling me? And how can I design the next experiment to see if that's really what's happening? And if it's not, then what is happening? And so my mother was terminal with ovarian cancer when I was a kid. She was in her 40s, and it was a very tough ordeal. This was back in the 1970s, and cancer treatment was nowhere near as advanced as it is today. My father was a surgeon, so I was always interested in medicine and in the way people's health, functions, or how they got sick, and what you could do to try to fix it. And unfortunately, my mom died after a 2-year battle with it. And I decided that my father wanted me to become a physician, and I thought about that for a while, but I decided that like I said, what gets me going is to ask the how and the why and the what if kind of questions, and that I felt was a little bit more conducive to being a scientist. So I did go to Einstein Medical School and study cancer, and I started actually as a technician at a place called Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. Working on some genes that promote cancer. They're called oncogenes. And again, our bodies are amazing. We have genes that naturally inside of us try to put the brakes on runaway cell growth, which is really what cancer is. And they're called tumor suppressor genes. And the interaction, what we find out is, we talked about mutations causing cancer. A lot of times the mutations are in genes that promote cancer or put the brakes on cancer. And when that doesn't function properly anymore, that non-cancerous cell becomes a cancerous cell. And so that's what I started studying at Cold Spring Harbor, and then went off to a PhD program at Einstein, like I said. And then I came to Brookhaven National Laboratory to do a postdoctoral fellowship. And they always tell you to do a postdoc in something slightly different, but at least close enough to where you're interested in it from what you did your PhD work in. And because, as we've been saying through this whole talk, we knew radiation causes DNA damage. DNA damage in enough hotspots can lead to cancer. It was close enough to it where I said, you know what, let me study radiation for, a few years. And I took a postdoc in accelerator-based radiobiology. I thought I was going to come to Brookhaven for 2 or 3 years to do that. And that was a little over 20 years ago. And, I moved up through the ranks here, and I'm really thankful. And it's become my life for the past 2 decades. And like I said, I get up excited to come to work every morning, even with the trials and tribulations, right? Not all experiments that we do work.
It's true.
Sometimes we have a hypothesis and we test it, and what we thought might be driving a certain response is not doing it, and you got to search somewhere else. But that all goes with the territory to me, and I still find it very stimulating and fascinating, and that's how I wound up doing what I do.
What advice in terms of school coursework or any kind of experience would advise you give to a student, whether that's a high school student or a college student, in terms of what he or she will you suggest that they do in order to pursue a career in STEM? What you advise them to them?
The first thing I would suggest is try to get some type of experience in the actual environment. Classroom training is great and it's important, and the textbooks and stuff, so you understand the theory. But if this is something that you're really interested in doing, whether it's bench kind of science or engineering, right? There's a lot of engineers at NASA that design the vehicles and the radiation detectors and the spacesuits and all of that, the rocket scientists and stuff. If you're interested in a career in STEM fields, seek out an internship, even if it's for a summer, and work in a laboratory and get to see outside of the classroom. It's like, what is it like for the people that come in and do this every day and choose to do this as their career? And what kind of work environment would I be looking at if I decided to pursue this? Brookhaven, in fact, has a lot of interesting educational paths. If you go to the Brookhaven website, www.bnl.gov, and go down to the link where it says educational opportunities, we have summer programs for people all the way from high school all the way up through undergraduate school at different levels. And as I said, go into a laboratory for a while and see what's available. especially in the summer when you might not have classes, or take on an internship. And like I said, get some experience. Volunteer if you need to in a laboratory or in some other type of scientific setting. I remember when I was finishing up undergraduate school, and I was still kind of torn between physician or scientist. I volunteered in an oncology ward at a hospital nearby here on Long Island to see, okay, if I decide to be a physician and I still want to study cancer like an oncologist, what would that be like every day? And the experience was very, very valuable to me to really get a sense as to, is this what I want to spend the next, for example, 20 years of my life doing? And so that would be my primary advice, is try seek out an opportunity where you can get some real world direct experience in that environment that's in addition to your classwork.
Yeah.
And it'll give you a world of understanding about choosing a field, because choosing a field is for your career path is a big decision.
Yeah, and those opportunities allows you to figure out what your likes and dislikes are, right?
Yes, correct. It can even be a dislikes kind of thing. Like when I volunteered in that oncology ward, after the experience with my mother and such, it was very rewarding, and I'm glad I did it. And it actually told me that I was more suited to be in the laboratory as opposed to treating people the way my father did. And and that's perfectly good. There's no right or wrong answers. It has to move you inside, and that makes going to work every day, for decades at a time, a lot more interesting and rewarding and stimulating.
Yeah, I mean, for the folks that are listening, the Department of Energy has a science undergraduate laboratory internship for college students. It's a paid internship, has a stipend associated to it, and we have the NASA Space Radiation Lab. That's an opportunity for students to explore this career field. And also, you have the high school research program as well for high school students. So there are opportunities out there for students to explore the various paths in STEM. We are at the 47-minute mark.
Okay.
I think it was a great conversation with you, Peter. It was wonderful having you today. We appreciate the time and the insights that you have into the field, into your field, the NASA Space Radiation work, and the advice that you have given to our students. Our next Science Thursday is November 19, 2020. We will post out there. We will send a notification out for our guest speaker for that time. We would like to say thank you to the Brookhaven National Lab for hosting this event today, and encourage you to look at our educational website, www.bnl.gov/education, for various opportunities. And thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe, wear your mask, and see you next time.